I went back to an area where it all began with community transformation in Tanzania. I went back and visited with some people that attended the very first CT training we ever did in Tanzania back in 2012. And got to hear some testimonies from this woman named Angelina and her husband John and some people in the village. And Angelina attended the very first training we ever did, and I was on the trip just as a volunteer. Didn't really know anything about E3 and way before God called me to this. And Angelina was a very reserved, quiet woman and from a very poverty-stricken area. And she sat through the class, didn't say anything. 8 or 9 months later, I went back for another trip to meet with the same group of women that we had trained to kind of do another training. And we were just trying to figure this whole thing out. And so the same group of ladies were there. Angelina was there, and we asked at the beginning for testimonies. Had anybody just done anything with what they had learned the first time we were there? And Angelina stood up and she says, I realized when I got home that poverty is in our minds. And she started talking about how after that very first training class, she went home and she just started looking around at her resources. It made her look at her environment differently. And where she lives, it's very rocky, so everybody's yard and all over the place are these big old rocks. She decided that those rocks were a resource and that people would buy the rocks to use in construction of homes and buildings and different things like goat pens and all that. And so she just started clearing her land around her house. It was in her yard, didn't have to go anywhere, piled them up, and then started selling them. Because she started thinking differently. Yeah. And then after that, she and another woman who had been in the class with her when they had gotten back, they started talking, and they decided to learn how to make bread, and they built a brick like bread fire oven, and they started making bread and selling it at the market. Then they started making soap. She knew how to sew, so she would borrow a sewing machine and start tailoring and mending people's clothes and sewing clothes. So it inspired an entrepreneur spirit in her. And when she got home and she started doing all these things, her husband, she started to make money to contribute income to her family and was able to help support her family and her husband. So now her family is more stable because there's more income, so they have consistent food, the kids are going to school, they're beginning to have revenue, steady income. So her husband, took notice of it, and what ended up happening was when she started doing productive things that contributed to the well-being of their family, it improved the relationship between her and her husband. Instead of her just being a wife, she became a helpmate to her husband. And she told me when I was there in March, she said, we began to love each other and we began to treat each other with respect, and it changed our marriage and it changed our family. And then my husband started coming alongside and we started working together and doing projects together. He's a pastor, and he also, from there, he brought the whole community together, and they identified that their greatest challenge in their village area was they don't have a medical clinic, and the closest medical clinic or doctor or any kind of medical services is about probably 6 to 10 miles away. And so for the last 4 years, their whole village has been working together to build this medical clinic, and they've built it from the ground up. And I have progression of pictures from when I went and visited in 2015 to 2017, and then 2 months ago, or a month ago in March. And now it's a 3-wing building. They have the roof on it. They have to finish, most of it has the floor in it, and they just have to finish like the inside, and they'll be ready to open it. And it has a whole wing that's going to be a birthing center for women to give birth, because right now they're having to walk about 10 miles on this dirt road to give birth, and a lot of times they give birth on the side of the road and their babies die, or it's very risky for them. And while we were there, there was this woman who, John was telling us this story, who is Angelina's husband, and we were looking at the progress and praying over it and everything, and he says, you know, just have your friends at home pray. We'll be able to finish the construction and quickly and open it quickly, because this woman right here is pregnant and she wants to give birth in this hospital so that her baby doesn't die on the side of the road. And I was just like, oh my gosh. And they even have all the materials where they're going to build a house for the doctors, for 2 doctors to live, so when it's open and the doctors come. But they have worked tirelessly, you know, for 4 years. And that village has experienced 2 famines that were true famines, where they didn't have rain for over a year, so they didn't have food, and people were dying, and they had to stop working on the building. And twice that's happened. And as soon as the famine was over and the rains came and they started to have food again, then they would start back on the work. So they've persevered and they haven't given up. So Angelina was kind of telling me this whole story of when we first met her in 2012, to her becoming a productive entrepreneur. The relationship with her husband and her whole family just has grown spiritually and biblically. Her husband now is getting ready he's planted a new church in the village between where he lives and where the medical clinic is, because he realized that there's a lot of people who don't know Jesus, and now he's a respected man of influence. People come to him for advice and for help, so he has influence over them and can share the gospel with them. So he's starting another church, and Angelina has a sewing center and an office building in town across from the medical clinic, and she has 2 sewing machines, and she is training other young ladies in the village how to sew, so they'll have a skill. So she's doing skill training in this center that she's been able to build, all from attending the very first CT class we held in Tanzania in 2012. So that's what transformation looks like. That's what we hope will happen, and to actually hear testimonies of that, to be able to go back and just visit, for one, was a huge blessing, but then to hear that testimony from her and to see it, and to see the love and the excitement on her eyes, and to see she and her husband together, and just what they're doing in their community and how it's helped others.